Rain pounded against the windows of the lawyer's office, a relentless drumming that matched the hammering of my heart. Margaret, my mother-in-law, sat across from me, her lips twisted into a smirk that made my stomach churn. She thought she'd won. She thought everything Daniel had left behind, our home, our savings, his legacy, belonged to her. Then the lawyer slid a letter across the desk, and her smug expression shattered like glass. "To my mother," Daniel's words began, "you've controlled me my whole life, but not anymore. Everything goes to Anna, the woman who loved me for me." Margaret's face turned crimson, her hands trembling as she crumpled the paper. She glared at me, her eyes promising revenge, and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. I should have known then that this was only the beginning. That night my phone rang, and a raspy voice hissed, "Leave the house or you're dead." My blood ran cold, and I realized Margaret wasn't just angry, she was dangerous. "My name is Anna Riley, and I'm 35, a small-town elementary school teacher with mousy brown hair and a quiet life that used to feel safe. Daniel was my anchor, my husband of 10 years, a man with warm hazel eyes and a laugh that could melt away my worries. We built a home together in the woods outside Seattle, a cozy cabin surrounded by towering pines. I never thought I'd be a widow at 35, never imagined I'd be sitting here clutching a phone, my hands shaking, after losing him to a long, cruel illness 6 months ago. Daniel was gone, but he'd left me everything. Our house, our savings, his love etched into every corner of our life. And now, Margaret, his venomous mother, wanted to rip it all away. I'd always known she hated me, calling me a gold digger despite the years I spent working beside Daniel to build what we had. But this was war. The lawyer's office that day was suffocating, the air thick with tension. Mr. Grayson, a wiry man with graying hair and a calm demeanor, had watched Margaret's meltdown with a faint twitch of amusement on his lips. I sat there, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles ached, still raw from Daniel's death. Margaret strutted in wearing an expensive black dress, her heels clicking like a predator's claws. She'd barely spoken to me since the funeral, except to sneer, "You'll be out on the street soon, where you belong." Her confidence made me feel small, like I was still the nervous girl she'd met a decade ago. But when Grayson read Daniel's will, her world crumbled. "To my beloved wife Anna, I leave our home, our savings, and all my personal assets," he said, his voice steady. Margaret's smirk faltered, but she leaned back, still arrogant, expecting the big prize, Daniel's investments, his stocks, to fall into her lap. Then came the letter. Grayson handed it to her, and as she read, her fury erupted. "This is a joke," she hissed, slamming it down. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Grayson slid me a copy, and as I read Daniel's words, tears stung my eyes, not from sadness but pride. "Mother, you've never controlled me and you won't control her. I owe you nothing." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret shoved the letter away, her hands trembling. "He was sick! He didn't mean this!" she spat. Grayson sighed. "He was of sound mind, Mrs. Caldwell. It's ironclad." She pointed a shaking finger at me. "You poisoned him against me." I met her gaze, my voice calm despite the storm inside. "No, Margaret, you did that yourself." She stormed out, and I exhaled, feeling a flicker of relief. But deep down, I knew she wouldn't let it go. That night, I sat alone in our cabin, the fire crackling softly, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. The woods outside were dark, the rain a constant murmur that usually soothed me, but now felt like a shroud pressing in. My hands rested on the armrests of Daniel's old leather chair, the one he'd sit in while reading late into the night, his glasses slipping down his nose. I could still smell his cologne on it, faint but there, a ghost of him lingering. Then the phone rang, sharp and jarring, slicing through the quiet. I ignored it at first, thinking it was a wrong number or some telemarketer too stubborn to quit. But by the 5th call, my nerves frayed, a tight coil of unease winding in my chest. I stood, my bare feet cold against the hardwood, and crossed to the kitchen counter where the old landline sat. My hand hovered over the receiver, hesitating before I picked it up. "Hello?" I said, my voice small. Silence at first, then a low, menacing rasp slithered through the line. "Leave the house, or you're dead." The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the counter as my breath caught, sharp and painful. Ice flooded my veins, and I stumbled back, my eyes darting to the windows, black voids staring back at me. The cabin, once my sanctuary, felt like a trap snapping shut. My legs shook as I grabbed my cell phone from the coffee table, fumbling to dial Claire Monroe, my best friend since college. Claire was a force. Sharp green eyes that could cut through lies, a cascade of red curls, and a journalist's nose for trouble that had gotten her into more scrapes than I could count. "Anna, what's wrong?" she answered on the first ring, her voice crisp despite the late hour. "Someone just threatened me," I said, my words trembling, barely holding together. "They said to leave the house or I'd die." There was a pause, then the sound of keys jingling. "I'm coming over," she said, no hesitation. "And we're hiring someone. This reeks of Margaret." I nodded, though she couldn't see me, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Within an hour, Claire burst through the door, her rain-soaked jacket dripping onto my floor, her face flushed with determination. "She's unhinged, Anna," she said, pacing the living room, her boots leaving wet streaks. "That smirk at the will reading, she's not done with you." My throat tightened. "I can't prove it's her," I whispered. Claire stopped, her eyes blazing. "We don't need proof yet. We need protection." She pulled out her phone and called Ryan Voss, a private detective she'd worked with on a story about corruption in Tacoma last year. "He's good," she said, waiting for him to pick up. "Quiet, but sharp as hell." When Ryan arrived at midnight, the rain had plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and his leather jacket glistened under the porch light. He was lean, late 20s, with a quiet intensity in his brown eyes that made me feel both safe and on edge. His boots left muddy prints as he stepped inside, scanning the room like he was memorizing every detail. "Show me where you found the phone," he said, his voice low, steady. I pointed to the kitchen counter, still rattled, my hands twisting together. He crouched, inspecting the baseboard, then moved to the windows, his fingers brushing the locks. He froze by the back door, his jaw tightening. "These tracks outside. Someone's been here." My stomach dropped, a sick lurch that made me grip the counter. "Who?" I whispered, barely audible. Ryan stood, his gaze hard. "We'll find out." The next morning the air felt heavier, the threat hanging over me like a storm cloud ready to burst. I was pouring coffee, my hands unsteady, when the doorbell rang. I flinched, spilling hot liquid on my fingers, and cursed under my breath as I crossed to the door. Through the peephole, I saw Sophie Caldwell, Daniel's younger sister, a wiry woman with haunted blue eyes and a guarded expression I hadn't seen in 15 years. She stood on my porch, her coat soaked, clutching a duffel bag. I opened the door, confusion warring with the dread still simmering in my gut. "Sophie?" I said, my voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" She brushed past me, her tone clipped. "I heard about the will. I'm here to claim my share." I stared, stunned, as she dropped her bag by the couch. "Daniel didn't mention you in it," I said, my throat dry. She smirked, a shadow of Margaret's cruelty flickering across her face. "We'll see." She sat, crossing her legs, and lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward. "I left because of her, Margaret. She threatened Dad before he died. I think she killed him." My knees buckled, and I sank into a chair. "What?" I breathed. Sophie's eyes darkened, her fingers trembling as she tapped ash into a saucer. "Car crash, my ass. She wanted the company. I ran because she'd have come for me next." Before I could process her words, Claire stormed in, her sling from the hit and run last night making her look fiercer somehow. "Anna, check this," she said, thrusting a torn photo at me. I took it with shaking hands, Daniel and Sophie as kids, gap-toothed and grinning, with trader's pay scrawled in red ink across their faces. My breath hitched, fear clawing up my spine. "Where'd you find this?" I asked. "Your mailbox," Claire said, her voice tight. "Someone's watching you." Ryan stepped forward, taking the photo, his brow furrowing. "Margaret?" I whispered, my voice breaking. Sophie snorted. "Or one of her dogs." Ryan's jaw clenched. "I'll check the perimeter again. Stay inside." That afternoon, I met Lila Hayes, the new neighbor who'd moved into the cabin down the road a month ago. She knocked on my door, a petite woman with nervous hands and a tangle of blonde hair, holding a plate of cookies. "I heard about your husband," she said, her voice soft. "I'm sorry." I forced a smile, though my nerves were raw. "Thanks. It's been rough." She glanced past me, her eyes flickering to Sophie lounging on the couch. "You've got company," she said, hesitating. If you need anything, I'm close. There was something in her tone, fear maybe, that made me pause, but I brushed it off. Appreciate it, I said, closing the door. Later, Ryan pulled me aside. I saw her watching the house earlier, he murmured. Lila, she's not just a neighbor. My stomach twisted. You think she's with Margaret? He shrugged. I don't trust anyone yet. A week later, the threats turned physical. I woke to the sound of glass shattering, a cold wind rushing through the cabin. My heart leapt into my throat as I stumbled out of bed, barefoot, and crept into the living room. The window was a jagged hole, furniture overturned, photos of Daniel and me shredded on the floor. My chest tightened, a sob catching in my throat as I backed away, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The police came, their flashlights cutting through the dark, but found no one, just the wreckage of my life. This wasn't a robbery, Ryan said later, standing in the wreckage, his voice grim. It's a message. I nodded, tears burning my eyes. She wants me gone. Claire, her arm still in that damn sling, gripped my shoulder. She's escalating. We need dirt on her. Now. Ryan's eyes narrowed. I've got a lead. Offshore accounts tied to Margaret. Millions. This isn't just about the house. That night, alone again, I couldn't sleep. The rain hammered the roof, and every creak made me jump. I wandered into Daniel's study, running my fingers over his desk, desperate for some piece of him to hold on to. My foot caught on a loose floorboard, and I froze. Kneeling, I pried it up, my pulse racing, and found a metal box tucked beneath. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was Daniel's journal, its leather cover worn soft. I flipped through, my breath catching at his jagged handwriting. If I die, find Sophie. She knows what Mom did to Dad. Tears blurred my vision. He'd known Margaret's darkness, maybe even feared her. I clutched the journal, a mix of grief and fury surging through me. He'd left me a trail, and I'd follow it, no matter where it led. The next day I showed the journal to Claire and Ryan. Sophie hovered nearby, her cigarette smoke curling in the air. Dad's crash, she said, her voice low. I saw her with a guy, David, Daniel's friend, days before. They were arguing about money. My blood ran cold. David, Daniel's best man, the one who'd cried at his funeral. You think he's in on this? I asked, my voice shaking. Sophie shrugged. He's her lapdog. Ryan flipped through the journal, his brow creasing. There's more. Daniel mentions a safe. You know where it is? I shook my head, my mind spinning. Claire grinned, fierce despite her pain. Let's tear this place apart. We searched for hours, Sophie chain-smoking, Ryan methodical, Claire relentless. Dusk settled, the woods outside growing blacker, when I noticed a seam in the basement wall, a hidden panel. My heart pounded as I pushed it open, revealing a small safe. Our anniversary, I whispered, punching in the date. It clicked, and I pulled out a stack of papers, bank records, transfers, proof Margaret had siphoned millions from Dad's company. Holy shit, Claire breathed, scanning them. She's a thief. Ryan's eyes darkened. And a killer, if Sophie's right. I felt sick, betrayed, but a fire ignited in me. We've got her, I said, my voice steady for the first time in days. But Margaret wasn't waiting. That night, the rain turned torrential, a roar against the cabin. I was alone, Ryan and Claire chasing a lead on David, Sophie off somewhere smoking her nerves away. A shadow flickered outside and my stomach dropped. The front door crashed open, and a man in a ski mask charged in, his knife catching the firelight. I screamed, my body reacting before my mind, and dodged as he swung. The blade sliced the air inches from my face, and I grabbed a lamp, swinging it hard. It cracked against his arm, and he grunted, stumbling. I bolted for the basement, my socks slipping on the stairs, and slammed the door, fumbling the lock. My breath came in gasps as I backed into the dark, the safe's papers still clutched in my hand. Footsteps thudded above, slow, deliberate. My hands shook as I dialed Ryan. He's here, I hissed. Get back now. A gunshot rang out upstairs, and I flinched, my heart hammering. Then Ryan's voice shouted, Anna! The intruder's steps retreated, and I heard tires screeching outside. Ryan burst into the basement, his gun drawn, his face pale. You okay? He asked, breathless. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. She sent him, I said, my voice breaking. Ryan holstered his weapon, his jaw tight. "We're ending this." Ryan's words hung in the air. "We're ending this." As he stood in the basement, his gun still warm in its holster, the echo of the intruder's gunshot fading into the rain-soaked night. My hands clutched the papers from the safe, the edges digging into my palms, proof of Margaret's crimes trembling between my fingers. I nodded, my tears mixing with the damp chill of the room, a fire igniting beneath my fear. "She's not taking anything else from me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Ryan's eyes met mine, a flicker of respect in them. "Good. We hit back tomorrow." But tomorrow felt a lifetime away, and the shadows outside seemed to pulse with menace. The next morning, Claire hobbled in, her sling tighter after a restless night, her face pale but her jaw set. "I called a contact at the Seattle Times," she said, dropping a stack of printouts on the kitchen table. "Those offshore accounts Ryan found, they tie back to Margaret and David." My heart stuttered. David, with his easy grin and warm hugs at our wedding, the man who'd carried Daniel's coffin with tears streaming down his face. Sophie, perched on the counter with a cigarette dangling from her lips, snorted. "Told you. He's been her errand boy since Dad died." I snatched the papers, my eyes scanning the transactions, thousands, then millions, funneled through shell companies. "Why would he do this?" I whispered, betrayal cutting deeper than the knife last night. Ryan leaned over my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. "Money? Fear? Pick one. We need him to talk." We tracked David to a dive bar on the edge of town, the kind of place where the air stank of stale beer and desperation. He sat in a corner booth nursing a whiskey, his broad shoulders hunched like he carried the weight of his own lies. I slid in across from him, Claire and Ryan flanking me, Sophie lurking by the jukebox with a scowl. "Hey, Anna," David said, his voice too calm, his eyes avoiding mine. "Tell me it's not true," I said, my throat tight, hands clenched under the table. "Tell me you're not helping her." He swirled his glass, ice clinking, then sighed. "She said Daniel changed his mind, showed me a will. I believed her." My nails dug into my palms. "You're lying, or she paid you." Silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until he muttered, "She's got dirt on me. Old stuff. I had no choice." Sophie stepped forward, her voice venomous. "You helped her kill Dad, didn't you?" David's head snapped up, fear flashing in his eyes. "No, I just moved money. That's all." I shoved the bank records at him. "This says different." He stared, his hands shaking, then slumped. "I'm done. I'll testify." But Margaret moved faster. That night, Claire's car screeched into my driveway, her face ashen. "Someone rammed me off the road," she said, her voice trembling, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. "Black SUV, no plates." My stomach lurched. "She's coming for us," I said, panic rising. Ryan grabbed his phone. "I'm calling in a favor. We need backup." His favor was Jake Morris, a grizzled ex-cop turned security guy, broad as a linebacker with a scar snaking down his cheek. He arrived an hour later, his pickup rattling and sized me up. "Heard you've got a psycho mother-in-law," he said, his gravelly voice laced with amusement. "I've dealt with worse." I managed a weak smile, but my nerves screamed. She wasn't just a psycho, she was a monster. The breaking point came 2 nights later. I was in the kitchen, Jake stationed by the door, when the power cut out, plunging the cabin into darkness. My breath caught, the silence deafening until a window shattered upstairs. "Anna, down!" Jake roared, shoving me behind the counter as footsteps thudded above. Ryan burst in from the porch, gun drawn, Claire and Sophie behind him. "They're here," he hissed. A figure in black dropped into the living room, and Jake tackled him, grunting as fists flew. I crawled to the basement stairs, my heart pounding, when Margaret's voice cut through the chaos, cold, mocking. "Enjoying the house, Anna?" I froze, peering up to see her silhouetted in the doorway, a gun glinting in her hand. "You took my son," she snarled. "Now I take everything." Sophie lunged at her, screaming, "You killed Dad!" Margaret swung the gun, cracking Sophie's temple, and she crumpled. I scrambled for the lamp, my hands slick with sweat, and hurled it. It smashed against Margaret's shoulder and she stumbled, firing wild. Ryan tackled her, the gun skidding across the floor. I grabbed it, my hands trembling, and pointed. "It's over," I said, my voice raw. She laughed, a brittle, broken sound. "You'll never be free of me." The police swarmed in, lights flashing through the trees, and Margaret was cuffed, her face twisted with rage as they dragged her away. Sophie groaned, blood matting her hair, but alive. David's testimony came the next day. He spilled everything: Margaret's embezzlement, her blackmail, her role in Dad's crash. But as Ryan sorted through the safe's papers, he found a name we hadn't expected: Victor Hensley. "Daniel's dad's old partner," Ryan said, his voice tight. "He's tied to the accounts, too." My blood ran cold. Victor knocked on my door that afternoon, a tall man with slick gray hair and a predator's smile. "Half this estate's mine," he said, his tone smooth. "Sign it over, or Sophie's next." I stared, fear and fury warring inside me, then slammed the door. Ryan grinned. "He doesn't know about the trap." Daniel's trap was genius, a silent alarm wired to the safe, linked to his lawyer's office. I'd triggered it nights ago, and now the FBI had everything: records, David's confession, Victor's name. They raided his penthouse that night, hauling him out in cuffs as he shouted threats into the dark. Margaret's trial was a massacre: 15 years for fraud, conspiracy, manslaughter. Victor got 20, his empire crumbling. David took a plea, 10 years, his betrayal a bitter stain. I sold the cabin, the woods too haunted now, and moved to Portland, a small apartment with a view of the river. One night, unpacking, I found a cassette in Daniel's old jacket. His voice crackled through the static. "If you hear this, run. There's one more out there." My heart skipped, a chill creeping up my spine. I looked out the window, the city lights flickering, and wondered, who? Margaret rots in a cell now, her power stripped, her days spent staring at concrete walls, knowing Daniel outsmarted her from the grave. Victor's wealth can't buy his freedom, his screams silenced by bars. I'm free, healing, breathing easier with every sunrise, but that cassette gnaws at me. Daniel gave me justice, a chance to live, and I'll carry his love forward. The lesson? Greed devours, love endures, and secrets never stay buried. What do you think, whoever's reading this? Was Daniel warning me about someone real, or just the ghosts of our past? Drop your thoughts below. I could use the company.